And reading from the Gospel according to Matthew, the 11th chapter, the 28th verse and following. The words are familiar, but try to hear them for the first time. Jesus is speaking. "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The walk from our garage to the house isn't a long one, but long enough that when I come in with a big load of groceries, I look at all those bags and try to decide if they're too heavy to carry all at once, or do I have to make 2 trips? Well, go back to ancient people when most loads were carried by women and men loaded down with jars of water and bags of grain or whatever. They needed to be efficient in how they carried all that load. So enter the yoke, used to carry all kinds of things. Now, if you're like me, you tend to think of a yoke as something that holds 2 farm animals together as a team. The yoke Jesus talks about here is the kind of yoke that someone puts on their shoulders. It's kind of wooden bar, and it's shaped to go around your neck, and long bars that go out like this, and then you hang your packages off of it. Baskets, packages, jars, whatever, can be hung off of those bars. Maybe you've seen the picture of someone carrying such a yoke, and they can be so loaded down that you can hardly even find them under all that stuff. You can carry far more than if you had those burdens in your hands or even strapped to your back. A yoke makes it easier to carry a heavy burden. As Jesus invites us into discipleship, he offers for our use a yoke that he has fashioned. You know, all of us come into discipleship, come to Jesus with some burdens to bear. And they're different from each and every one of us. None of us come empty-handed with no history. But some folk have harder burdens to bear than others. Perhaps there are issues from your past that weigh you down. Or perhaps someone you counted on has let you down and you betrayed your trust. Or you're living today with a sense of confusion and it just isn't clear where you're headed, and you wonder just where am I going and what's the path that I need to take. The worry keeps you awake at night. Or maybe you have demands at home that weigh you down, and you sometimes wonder if you can indeed bear that load. You look at the world around you and wonder, how do I make sense of all of this? How do I carry all these burdens? Well, like just about everything else in the world, some yokes are not well crafted. They rub the wrong way, or they're off balance, or they break under the load. Others are well made and fit easily. They do the job that they're intended to do. And if you're going to be using a yoke, you certainly want the one rather than the other. The places we can turn for help can be like that. Some friends disappear when trouble comes. Others really don't want to hear about our problems. We think we have the world all figured out, and then something just breaks it apart, and we have no way to understand or make sense of what's going on around us. Take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy, says Jesus. I'll help you bear the burdens. I'll give you the strength to get through. I'll show you how to live in a way that is strong and joyous and whole. But you must pick up the yoke. You must make a decision to follow Jesus and use the yoke he offers. No one can do that for you, and you must make the choice to use this particular yoke. In his book, Velvet Elvis, Rob Bell talks about another kind of yoke. You know, early on, a lot of folk thought of Jesus as a rabbi, a teacher. And part of a rabbi's job was to interpret the law. You know, this you can do, this you cannot do. And just think back about all the times in the Bible where you see people come to Jesus and ask him for an interpretation of the law. What is it you can or can't do on the Sabbath? Can you heal? Can you do... Which law is the most important? What does the law say about forgiveness? 3 times? 7 times? Jesus gets a lot of the kinds of questions that folk brought to their rabbis. And as you can imagine, not all rabbis had quite the same list of do's and don'ts. In his book, Velvet Elvis, Rob Bell says, a rabbi's set of rules and lists, which was really that rabbi's interpretation of how to live the Torah, that was called the rabbi's yoke. And when you followed a certain rabbi, you were following him because you believed that that rabbi's set of interpretations were the closest to what God intended through the scriptures. And when you followed that rabbi, you were taking up that rabbi's yoke. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, says Jesus. Let me teach you how to live in God's way. Jesus plays the role of rabbi, but he does it in a way that is different from the others. You know, usually a rabbi would cite another more prominent rabbi as a way to gain support for their own views. You know, Rabbi so-and-so says, but not Jesus. Listen to how often we hear, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. And you know, the folk who were listening were either amazed that he would dare to talk like that, or offended. Who would speak on their own authority? He doesn't teach like others. Who does he think he is? Well, we know who he thought he was. And if Jesus had cited an authority, it would have been God. Well, how did Jesus talk about the law? You know, nothing raised his anger faster than folk who got in the way of people struggling to know God. That's why he gets so angry at the Pharisees. They make rules and rules and rules instead of trusting folk to somehow sort it out for themselves and figure out what it was God wanted from them. Now, we all know people like that, but the fact is Jesus has very few rules. He doesn't hand us a checklist and say, you know, do 1, do 2, do 3. But what he does have is a passion for justice. Not blind justice, but God's justice that puts a finger on the scales to weight them in favor of the poor and the outcast. Jesus talks about being willing to look at our own lives honestly. Honestly enough to know where it is we need to be forgiven. And then in turn extend that forgiveness to others. He paints a picture of a wonderful banquet where everyone is welcome, even those whom most would despise and turn away. He takes evil very seriously, but he also wants us to laugh and dance and rejoice. Jesus offers a freedom that truly does make the burdens of life easier to bear. Instead of worry and uncertainty, he offers trust. Trust that somehow you will get through whatever the future brings. He gives us rest for our souls. Amen and amen.